The Spanish Foreign Ministry official reading the report in Madrid on December 14, 1941, had a very specific problem. The previous afternoon, a German submarine had surfaced in the Western Mediterranean, stopped a Spanish oil tanker, ordered its crew to abandon ship, and then put a torpedo into it. 3 sailors had drowned when a lifeboat swamped during the panicked launch. The ship, the Badalona, was now on the seabed east of Gibraltar. It had been carrying ballast, no cargo, no contraband, nothing a belligerent nation could object to. It was owned by Spain's state petroleum monopoly. It flew the Spanish flag. It was, by every legal measure, the property of a country that was officially neutral in this war. The submarine that sank it was German. Francisco Franco had spent 2 years carefully threading the needle between Germany and the Allies, owing Hitler a debt from the Spanish Civil War, while also staying out of a conflict his exhausted country couldn't afford to join. German submarines were secretly refueling in Spanish ports. Spain was selling Germany tungsten for armor-piercing shells. The two countries were bound together by ideology, gratitude, and mutual interest. And now, a German U-boat had just killed 3 Spanish sailors and sunk a Spanish state ship. The phone lines between Madrid and Berlin were about to get a workout. To understand why the sinking of one 4,000-ton oil tanker turned into a diplomatic incident, you need to understand the extraordinary balancing act Franco's Spain was performing in December 1941. Spain had not joined the war, officially, but it was not neutral in any meaningful sense either. Hitler had personally backed Franco during the Spanish Civil War, sending German aircraft and military advisors to help the nationalist forces win. That debt was real, and Franco knew it. The Condor Legion, German aircraft and pilots sent to Spain between 1936 and 1939, had provided crucial air support that helped the nationalists prevail. The bombing of Guernica, which became one of the defining atrocities of the 20th century, was carried out by German aircraft on behalf of Franco's forces. Hitler had also sent armor, advisors, and logistics. Without German and Italian support, Franco's side might not have won. Franco understood this. He was not the kind of man who forgot his debts. When France fell in June 1940, Franco declared Spain a non-belligerent, a diplomatic category that essentially meant pro-German without actually committing to fight. Spanish volunteers were permitted to join German forces on the Eastern Front, organized into what became known as the Blue Division. Spain sold Germany tungsten, a mineral essential for armor-piercing weapons, as the second largest producer after Portugal, shipping over 1,000 metric tons annually between 1941 and 43. And, in Spanish ports, secretly, German submarines were refueling and resupplying between patrols, drawing alongside German tankers at night and sailing before dawn. The British and Americans knew about most of this. They tolerated it because the alternative was worse. Spain's position at the mouth of the Mediterranean, controlling the approaches to Gibraltar, made it one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate on Earth. If Franco decided to join the Axis formally, the Strait of Gibraltar could be closed. Allied supply lines to North Africa and the Middle East would be cut. The consequences were serious enough that both Britain and the United States spent enormous diplomatic energy and oil, keeping Spain in its awkward non-belligerent position rather than pushing it into active hostility. Oil was the key lever. Spain produced almost none of its own. It depended on imports for nearly everything. The Allies controlled the sea lanes. They could embargo Spanish oil supply at any point, and they used the threat and occasional actual reductions to keep Franco cooperative. In 1940, Britain imposed an oil embargo on Spain. Franco, facing a country already devastated by civil war and now unable to fuel its transportation or fishing fleet, a crucial source of protein for a hungry population, was forced to seek accommodation. Spain had no refining capacity and no alternative suppliers who could reach it past Allied naval control. In January 1941, The regime was rationing bread. So Franco balanced. He leaned toward Germany ideologically. He leaned toward the Allies economically. He signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in November 1941, a gesture of solidarity with the Axis, while simultaneously allowing Allied supervised monitoring of Spanish oil imports to verify the fuel wasn't being diverted to German use. He let German submarines refuel quietly in Vigo, then denied it when the British protested. He sent volunteers to the Eastern Front while formally refusing to declare war on Britain or America. It was a performance of calculated ambiguity that required constant management, and it was working, more or less, until a German submarine surfaced next to a Spanish state tanker east of Gibraltar on December 13th, 1941. The Badalona was not a new ship. It had been built in 1922 at a British shipyard on the River Tyne, originally for a Filipino tobacco company under the name Arnus. It changed hands and names several times before ending up as the Badalona in 1928, owned by the Compañía Arrendataria del Monopolio de Petróleos, known by its Spanish acronym CAMPSA, the state monopoly that controlled Spain's petroleum supply. CAMPSA was not a minor private concern. It was the organization responsible for keeping Spain supplied with oil. Its tankers were, in an almost direct sense, Spanish national property. The Badalona was on a voyage from Valencia to Aruba in the Caribbean to pick up petroleum and bring it back to Spain. It was traveling in ballast, empty, and flying the Spanish flag. Nothing about it suggested enemy activity. At 4:44 in the afternoon on December 13th, U-453 surfaced, close aboard, and ordered the tanker to stop. The Badalona's crew did not stop. They tried to run, and they used their radio. That decision, made in the panic of the moment, mattered enormously for what came next. Under the German Navy's prize rules, the regulations governing how enemy or suspicious ships were to be handled, a vessel that tried to escape and used its radio to broadcast a distress signal had technically violated the prize rules by refusing to comply with an order to heave to. Commander Egon Rainer von Schlippenbach, commanding U-453, fired a round from the deck gun across the Badalona's bow. The tanker stopped. His crew boarded and examined the ship's papers. Spanish flag, Spanish, our registry, CAMPSA ownership, cargo, ballast, destination, Aruba. It was, unambiguously, a neutral ship. But she had tried to run and she had radioed. Under the prize rules Schlippenbach was operating with, that was sufficient grounds to sink her. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. The launch of the lifeboats was rushed. One lifeboat swamped in the process. 3 members of the Badalona's crew drowned in the water east of Gibraltar. The others survived. At 6:05 in the evening, the Badalona took a torpedo and settled by the stern. She didn't sink immediately. Her tank structure held her up for a while, damaged but afloat. At 6:20, Schlippenbach put a second torpedo into her, and she broke in 2. By the time he dove and moved on toward his patrol area in the Mediterranean, 3 Spanish sailors were dead, and a Spanish state tanker was on the bottom. The war had been going on for over 2 years. Spain had stayed out of it, and a German submarine had just killed Spaniards. The timing made everything worse. December 13th, 1941. 6 days after Pearl Harbor, 4 days after Germany declared war on the United States. The strategic situation had shifted enormously in the past week. America was now a belligerent. The war that had been a European conflict became a genuinely global one. Every neutral country on Earth was suddenly recalculating where it stood, what its risks were, and who it needed to keep on its good side. Franco had spent most of 1941 watching the war develop and making careful decisions about Spain's position. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June, he'd allowed Spanish volunteers to join the Eastern Front, a gesture to Hitler without formal commitment. He'd signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in November, another signal of ideological alignment. In October, at a famous meeting at Hendaye on the French-Spanish border, Hitler had pressed Franco personally to join the Axis. Franco said he was interested in principle but couldn't commit. His list of conditions, territorial gains in North Africa, enormous supplies of food and fuel, weapons and military equipment Spain couldn't afford, was, one historian has observed, designed to be unacceptable. Franco always stopped short, but always stopping short required that nothing happened to make the relationship dramatically worse. 3 dead Spanish sailors and a sunken Kamsa tanker were not what the relationship needed. The Spanish Foreign Ministry filed a formal protest with Germany. The Germans were embarrassed. U-boat headquarters had not authorized or intended the sinking of a neutral Spanish ship. Schlippenbach had acted on his reading of the prize rules, and technically he wasn't wrong that a ship fleeing and using its radio had forfeited some protections. But technically correct and politically disastrous were 2 different things, and every official in Berlin who dealt with the Spanish relationship understood this immediately. Germany compensated Spain. The details of the settlement aren't fully documented in the surviving records, but the German government acknowledged the sinking, expressed regret, and made financial restitution for the lost ship and its dead crew. It was handled with the speed of a government that understood it had made a costly mistake with a partner it needed to keep friendly. The whole affair was contained, kept out of the press, managed through diplomatic channels, resolved in a way that gave Spain something concrete and gave Germany the ability to move forward without a formal rupture. But the incident didn't disappear cleanly. It became part of a pattern, and the Germans' ability to keep managing the pattern was diminishing because the British were also applying pressure from the other direction. Here's the thing about Spain's neutrality in 1941. It was being exploited by both sides simultaneously, and both sides knew it. The Germans were refueling submarines in Spanish ports. This was happening at Vigo on Spain's Atlantic coast, at other locations, and briefly in the Canary Islands before British protests forced the Spanish to close those operations. The submarines drew alongside German tankers already anchored in port, took on fuel and supplies in the night, and sailed before dawn. Spanish harbour authorities were instructed to look the other way. The arrangement had been agreed between the 2 governments in November 1939, before the war really began. It allowed German submarines to extend their operational range into the Atlantic without having to return all the way to France or Germany, a significant tactical advantage in the early war period. In July 1941, the British Embassy in Madrid filed a formal protest with the Spanish government over the refueling, stating what it knew about the practice. Spain denied it, as it had to. But by late 1941, British intelligence had what it considered irrefutable proof. The crew of U-434 had been captured shortly after refueling at Vigo, and under interrogation they confirmed the arrangement. Following the series of British protests, Spain started scaling down the program in late 1941 and terminated operations in the Canary Islands. The practice continued on a reduced basis into 1942 before effectively stopping. The Germans understood they were asking Spain to take risks. They were asking the Spanish government to break its own declared neutrality obligations, to conceal what it was doing from the British, and to absorb the diplomatic consequences if discovered. In return, Germany offered political solidarity, shared ideology, and trade access. What it did not offer was the operational care that would have prevented a German submarine commander from reading his prize rules in a way that ended with 3 Spanish sailors in the water. Those prize rules deserve some explanation, because they're central to why this incident happened the way it did. At the start of the war in September 1939, Germany's U-boats operated under what were called cruiser rules, also known as prize rules, a set of international conventions governing how warships could treat merchant vessels. The rules stated, among other things, that a merchant ship could not be sunk without first giving its crew an opportunity to abandon ship, and that using lifeboats as that place of safety only counted if the safety of the crew was actually ensured by the proximity of land or the presence of another rescue vessel. they also contained a critical exception. If a merchant vessel showed persistent refusal to stop on being duly summoned, or active resistance to visit or search, it lost its protected status. Germany formally moved to unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning attacks without warning, in December 1939, with War Order number 100 and 54. In practice, how closely any individual commander followed or departed from the earlier rules varied considerably. The Mediterranean in 1941 was a theatre where German submarines were still conducting some surface stops of suspicious vessels, particularly in encounters close to neutral territories. Schlippenbach surfaced, ordered the Badalona to stop, and when she ran and used her radio, which was itself grounds under the prize rules for treating her as having forfeited her protections, he enforced the rules as he understood them. The Badalona incident was, from the German perspective, an operational accident. A new commander on his first combat patrol, following regulations as he understood them, encountering a ship that had technically forfeited its protections by fleeing and radioing. Schlippenbach wasn't acting maliciously, he was acting as his training dictated. But from the Spanish perspective, it looked like this. Germany was asking Spain to secretly support its submarine campaign, at risk to Spain's declared neutrality, and Germany's submarines were simultaneously killing Spanish sailors in international waters. That was not a sustainable arrangement. Understanding what U-453 was doing in that part of the ocean helps explain how accidents like the Badalona happened. The Strait of Gibraltar was one of the most dangerous passages in the world for a submarine. The Royal Navy maintained an active anti-submarine presence there. Aircraft from Gibraltar, destroyers, patrol vessels. The current through the strait runs eastward along the surface and westward at depth. German submarines learned to use that deeper westward current to ride silently under the surface. Engines off, letting the water carry them through the narrows at night. It required timing, nerve, and luck. Roughly 60 German submarines made the attempt to enter the Mediterranean between 1941 and 1944. Only one completed the round trip. Once you were in, you were in. The passage back out against the current was even harder. Schlippenbach made it through on December 9th, 1941. 4 days later, he encountered the Badalona. He was on his first combat patrol in this boat. He'd been commanding U-453 since July, but the early months had been training. This was new operational ground for him. The Mediterranean was a different environment from the Atlantic, shallower, more enclosed, with different acoustic properties that affected sonar and made submarine warfare its own specific discipline. The convoy routes he'd been told to target carried supplies from Gibraltar to the British garrison at Malta and onward to British forces in Egypt. A Spanish tanker traveling in ballast from Valencia toward the Atlantic was not his target. But it was also a vessel that ran from him, used its radio, and declined to stop when ordered. The encounter happened in the late afternoon, in clear visibility, east of Gibraltar in the Alboran Sea. He handled it as his rules of engagement suggested he should. 3 Spanish sailors died. The German diplomatic crisis was immediate, and Schlippenbach continued his patrol. The Badalona wasn't the only time German U-boats created problems by attacking ships whose neutrality they couldn't verify or chose not to respect. The broader issue for the German submarine campaign was that neutral shipping was everywhere in the waters where U-boats operated. In the Atlantic and Mediterranean, ships from Portugal, Sweden, Argentina, Spain, Turkey, and other neutral countries moved regularly through the same sea lanes as Allied merchant shipping. At periscope depth, or in poor visibility, distinguishing a neutral flag from an enemy one was sometimes genuinely difficult. At night, at range, with limited intelligence about which ships were where, it could be nearly impossible. And as the war intensified, and Allied shipping learned to make itself harder to identify from a distance, the problem got worse. The first accidental sinking of a ship Germany wasn't supposed to touch happened on the very first day of the war at sea, September 3rd, 1939. U-30 torpedoed the passenger liner Athenia, which the commander believed might be an armed merchant cruiser. It was actually a civilian vessel carrying over 1,000 people, including about 300 Americans. 117 people died. The German government initially denied any submarine had done it, then blamed British sabotage. It was, in the first hours of submarine warfare in the Second World War, a preview of how the conflict between what the prize rules required and what submarine warfare actually looked like would play out for the next 6 years. What made the Badalona incident unusual was specifically that Schlippenbach had actually followed the prize rules. He surfaced, he stopped the ship, he examined its papers, he ordered the crew to abandon ship before sinking it. Most submarine attacks on neutral ships in the later war years were not conducted with that level of procedure. By 1942 and 43, German submarine commanders were under instructions that effectively authorized unrestricted attack. Surfacing to comply with prize rules had become increasingly dangerous as Allied air and surface anti-submarine capabilities improved. A submarine on the surface was a submarine that could be bombed, rammed, or gunned. The procedural approach that Schlippenbach used on the Badalona was a professional practice that was becoming rarer as the war continued. The irony was that it was precisely because he tried to follow the rules that 3 people died. If he'd simply torpedoed the tanker without surfacing, as most of his colleagues were doing in similar situations by that point in the war, the 3 sailors who drowned in the swamped lifeboat would probably have survived. They died because Schlippenbach surfaced, stopped the ship, and required the crew to get into lifeboats under conditions that the prize rules themselves acknowledged were not automatically safe. The Treaty for the Limitation and Reduction of Naval Armaments, which codified the prize rules, specifically stated that lifeboats did not constitute a place of safety unless either land was close or another vessel was present to take survivors aboard. Neither condition was met east of Gibraltar on the afternoon of December 13th, 1941. The international convention Schlippenbach was following condemned the action his orders permitted. Germany couldn't punish him for that. He'd acted within his rules of engagement, and he'd acted more carefully than most of his contemporaries would have. And Spain couldn't simply accept 3 dead sailors as a cost of doing diplomatic business. The whole situation exposed a fault line at the heart of the German-Spanish arrangement. Spain was valuable to Germany precisely because it was neutral, but the U-boat campaign, operating in the waters around and through Spanish maritime geography, inevitably generated incidents that put that neutrality at risk. The 2 goals, maintain Spanish neutrality and wage unrestricted submarine warfare in adjacent waters, were in structural tension with each other. It was possible to manage that tension most of the time. The Badalona demonstrated what happened when it slipped. Egon Rainer von Schlippenbach continued his Mediterranean patrol after sinking the Badalona and went on to become one of the most experienced submarine commanders in that theatre. He served in the Mediterranean for the next 2 years, operating out of the base at La Spezia in northern Italy with the 29th U-boat flotilla. The Mediterranean was in many ways its own separate war. The distances were shorter, the waters more shallow, the weather more predictable. Allied air power was omnipresent in ways it wasn't yet. In parts of the Atlantic, the U-boats that operated there faced a different set of threats than their counterparts in the North Atlantic, but also found different opportunities. The supply routes between Gibraltar and Malta and onward to British forces in Egypt were heavily used and not always well protected. Over 17 patrols in the Mediterranean, U-453 sank 9 merchant ships, totaling roughly 23,000 gross registered tons, plus 1 warship. Schlippenbach received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in November 1943, awarded specifically for sinking 4 ships and the British destroyer Quail, as well as damaging 2 others. The citation reflected 2 years of methodical work in a difficult theatre. In May 1944, U-453's luck ran out. On May 21st, off the southern coast of Italy, the boat was depth-charged and sunk by 3 Royal Navy destroyers. The commander at the time was no longer Schlippenbach. He had left the boat in 1944 for a staff position at the Naval High Command. The loss of the boat and its crew belongs to whoever had taken command by then, not to the man who'd started its Mediterranean career by sinking a Spanish tanker. Schlippenbach survived the war, spent 3 months in an American prisoner of war camp after Germany surrendered, and later served in the post-war West German Navy, retiring as a captain in September 1972. He died in May 1979. His brief moment of diplomatic infamy, 3 dead Spanish sailors, 1 sunken Kamsa tanker, 1 phone call from Madrid to Berlin, was not, by the scale of the war around it, a particularly large event. But the war was made of incidents like it, accumulated over years. The Badalona incident was resolved through German compensation and Spanish complaints, and the relationship between Madrid and Berlin continued its complicated dance through the rest of the war. Spain quietly wound down the submarine refueling arrangements in late 1941 and early 1942, partly because of ongoing British pressure, and partly because incidents like the Badalona had demonstrated the risks of the arrangement. The diplomatic benefit of keeping Spain out of the war continued to outweigh, for both the Allies and Germany, any advantage to be gained by pushing it toward active belligerency. In May 1942, a different encounter between a German submarine and Spain produced a radically different kind of outcome. U-573 was operating in the Western Mediterranean when a British Hudson aircraft caught it northwest of Algeria and dropped depth charges on it. The submarine surfaced, badly damaged, taking on water, unable to dive. The crew, visible on the bridge, hands raised, were not attacked. The aircraft circled until it was low on fuel and had to return to Gibraltar. In the chaos of trying to get help, U-573's commander managed to restart 1 electric motor and limped northward toward the Spanish coast. German naval headquarters, recognizing that the boat was too damaged to reach any Axis port, ordered it to proceed to Cartagena. Under international law, a belligerent warship entering a neutral port in distress had to be interned, held by the neutral country for the duration of the war. Spain did exactly that. The boat was legally seized by the Spanish Navy and its crew was detained. The submarine sat in Cartagena for the rest of the war. After Germany surrendered, the Spanish Navy bought it. U-573 served in the Spanish Navy for decades. It was loaned out to appear in film productions, most famously playing the role of a different submarine in a German film. It was decommissioned in May 1970, on the 28th anniversary of the day it limped into Cartagena. Its war over before most of the conflict's worst years had even begun. The German Navy had spent years threading through the waters around Spain, trying to use Spanish neutrality and Spanish ports to sustain a campaign that by the mid-war years was consuming its own men faster than it could replace them. It had lost the Badalona to a prize rule interpretation that was technically correct and diplomatically disastrous. It had lost U-573 to a British aircraft and left it behind in Cartagena to serve out the remainder of the century under a foreign flag. Both incidents, in their different ways, demonstrate the same thing. Spain was never an asset that Germany could simply use. It was always a relationship that required management. And in a war that demanded so much management already, the room for that kind of diplomatic maintenance was constantly being squeezed. The German Navy spent 2 years cultivating Spain as a neutral friend, built supply networks in Spanish ports, agreed to secret fuel arrangements, accepted Spanish political conditions, managed the relationship with the care of someone handling something fragile. It took 1 U-boat commander following his prize rules to put 3 Spanish sailors in the water east of Gibraltar. The Badalona was 4,000 tons. She was built in England, owned by a Spanish state monopoly, and on her way to Aruba for oil Spain needed to keep its lights on. She wasn't a military target. She wasn't carrying anything Germany wanted to stop. But the prize rules said a fleeing ship forfeits its protections. The prize rules didn't say anything about what happens to your relationship with the country whose flag the ship was flying. That's the thing about prize rules. They were written to govern interactions with enemies. Spain wasn't the enemy. And when the rules met that reality, 3 men drowned in a lifeboat east of Gibraltar, and a phone rang in Berlin. The Germans paid. They apologized. They moved on. The Badalona stayed on the bottom,